Okay, I've been running around like a chicken with its head chopped clean off, running errands today, and I barely made it back in time. So, we've been doing the Summa Theologica by Aquinas. Yesterday, we got to look at a lot of sources, primarily Aristotelian ones, to help illustrate everything that we've been reading about in the Summa. Let's see if I can share this. So, what I'm going to do today is just continue with reading supplementary philosophical ideas, just going over the first two treatises. So let's make this a little wider so you can see it. Okay. So the first treatise is the Treatise on Sacred Doctrine. It only has one question: the nature and extent of sacred doctrine. But that one question has 10 dimensions to the question. So we did a video on the first one, the next 4, and then a video on the final 5, where we read the text out loud. The text is available on the website. I'm adding in all of these extra links to citations and things, so you can go right over to the Metaphysics, book 6, if that's what he's citing, in that section right here, Metaphysics 6. Anyway, we're adding more and more to the website all the time. We've got summations of the arguments. We've got cartoon versions of the arguments and then illustrations of some of the ideas that Aquinas is struggling with, some of the constructs he has in his mind about how these things relate to each other. But the first thing he wants to deal with before he gets into the existence and nature of God, which is what we started a couple of videos ago, is this question of, is human reason the only legitimate means of trying to come to some sort of truth? And Aquinas's conclusion is no, it's not. It's the foundation of philosophy, and that allows for the ground for all the other sciences, except for this one thing called sacred science or sacred doctrine. And that's the only one that's outside of something that's grounded. All of human reason here grounds the rest of our knowledge, but he thinks that there's a legitimate revealed doctrine, things that come from the divine directly to us, and that the poets and the priests and the whatever, they study that and try to understand. They have to use reason and argument with each other to try to work out how to conceptualize it and whether or not it's legitimately from God, and all sorts of difficult things they have to deal with. And of course, we as philosophers can criticize and assist them in a two-way conversation on all those things, just like they can challenge us and give us the grounding for what we're doing, but that there's a legitimate type of knowledge that can come from that, according to him. Now, that's not what he wants to do. He wants to do philosophy and give reasons for things, but one of the questions to consider is there another way of coming to truth besides this philosophical game? And if so, what would that be like, and what's its nature, and is it legitimate? Is it more noble than what we're doing, and so on? So if we scroll down here, we will see he's made a lot of distinctions between practical sciences and speculative sciences. He said sacred doctrine is both, but it's primarily speculative. It's nobler than the other sciences, he concluded, because its grounding is on something that cannot err, even if you can err in your understanding of it. At least what it's coming from is something that in principle cannot err, so it's a little bit above. And there were some other arguments for why that might be the case, because he says, in practicality, it's aimed at the most practical end, the purpose of all things. And um, we've looked at that well enough before. Its subject matter is the ultimate end, and it's the only one that's both speculative and practical. And anyway, so we looked at that. whether God is the object of the science, whether this argument and reason-based back and forth is a legitimate part of all of it, which he says it is. Why would it be appropriate to have metaphor or multiple senses to words when you're making arguments? So we read through all of that. And then once he's done dealing with that, and we saw how Aristotelian all these ideas were in our last video, um, then we move on to the next treatise, the treatise on the one God, and that begins with the first question, the existence of God. And we did a video on the first two questions, which are not proving or disproving God's existence. Rather, they're asking, could it even be possible to prove that God exists? And if so, how? And he takes it out of the realm of self-evident questions and says it would have to be demonstrated. And then he argues that it's the sort of thing that could be demonstrated one way or another. And then when he's done with all of that, he moves on to the next question, which is, does God exist? Still got to fill in a little bit of that. And so we did a video on his arguments for whether God exists. And he concludes that he does for five. There's 5 ways to prove that God exists. And we did that video as well. We're going to add those notes in there. And then yesterday we did this where we got to look at a lot of Aristotle and see just how similar Aquinas's way of thinking is as a scholastic. The scholastics, by definition, were people who revered Aristotle. So there were other camps of medieval thinkers, but the scholastics sort of ruled. And their chief was Aristotle. So they would quote Aristotle, and it would be as if they had won an argument as a result. So let's see. Here's some things we might notice. First of all, in the question, is God's existence self evident? He argues against Anselm. And what we're going to do here is take a look at Anselm. So this is Anselm's argument for the existence of God. It's not even a full page. If this is the first time that you've heard this argument, you're probably going to think, wait, what argument? That can't be an argument. But it turns out it is an argument, and it's a pretty powerful one. So Anselm says, not a cosmological argument, but an ontological argument. He says, okay, first, Lord, grant you who grant understanding to faith, grant me that, insofar as you know it beneficial. I understand that you are as we believe you are, that which we believe. Now, we believe that you are something than which nothing greater can be imagined. Okay, so he's saying, he's calling on the muse. He's asking for inspiration from the Holy Spirit. And he's saying, Lord, grant me the knowledge to faith. Show me how it could be the case that you really are. And as we think you are. And what we think you are is something that no one can imagine anything greater. So if you can imagine something greater than what I'm talking about, I must not be thinking about God. He's at least as great as the thing you're imagining or greater, because you can't imagine anything greater than God. So that's his definition of the divine. And he says, Lord, give me the wisdom to know that you are. And then he says, then is there no such nature, since the fool said in his heart, God is not. But certainly this same fool, when he hears this very thing that I am saying, something than which nothing greater can be imagined, understands what he hears. So this is an important premise to the argument. The definition he gave for God was something than which nothing greater can be imagined. And he says, anybody who denies that God exists knows what I'm talking about. They would say, sure, I know what you're talking about. You're talking about something greater than which nothing can be imagined. I just don't think that that thing exists. That's what the fool says, according to Anselm. He says he understands what he hears. He understands this definition. It's important that he understands it and that he regards it as meaningful. And then he wants to say, okay, let's look for the evidence pro and con and see if that thing exists. And what he understands is in his understanding, right? He has in his mind the notion of a thing greater than which it is not possible to imagine something being. Even if he does not understand that it actually is, he knows that it's something in his brain, that the words make sense. There's nothing There's nothing incoherent about the idea of something greater than which it is impossible to imagine. For it is one thing to be in the understanding, and it is another thing that a thing be. Okay. So we've got this idea of God, and we say, does that exist? Let's look for evidence. Let's put all the evidence yes here, all the evidence no over here, and let's see which one weighs more, and then we'll decide if we think that he exists. But Anselm says, not so fast. You don't have to go and examine the world. You don't have to demonstrate that God exists. You understand the definition of God, and the definition of God is something so great that it is not possible to imagine anything greater. It's greater than the greatest thing you can imagine, at least. When a painter imagines beforehand what he is going to make, he, in his understanding, knows what it is, but he has not yet made it. And so he does not yet understand that it is. But when he has already made it, he both has it in his understanding and he has already painted it. So he understands that it is. So those are two different things that you can understand an idea in your mind and you can understand that that idea is real or not real. Even the fool is bound to agree that there is, at least in the understanding, this is all he's trying to establish. All I'm trying to establish is that you know what I mean when I define something as greater than anything anyone else can imagine. Something so great you cannot imagine anything greater. That's all he's trying to say, is that you know what I'm talking about. In your understanding, you know what that means. So the fool has it in his understanding because when he hears it, he understands it. Whatever is understood is in the understanding. So that's it. He understands the idea. Okay, so far it doesn't look like he's established God's existence, but here we go. This is the end of the argument. And certainly, that than which a greater cannot be imagined cannot be in the understanding alone. For if it is at least in the understanding alone, it can be imagined that it also really exists, which is greater. But that's what we're talking about, the greatest thing you can imagine. Therefore, if that than which a greater cannot be imagined is in the understanding alone, that very thing than which a greater cannot be imagined is something than which a greater can be imagined, right? You're imagining the greatest thing and it not existing. Well, why did you change the subject? We weren't debating whether or not the second greatest thing you can imagine, whether it exists or not. We were talking about the greatest thing you can imagine. And the greatest thing you can imagine is that same thing, but also existing. So you don't get to change the subject from God to some lesser idea. You agreed at the beginning that we would look for evidence of whether or not the greatest thing it's possible to imagine, something you can't imagine anything greater than, whether or not it exists. Now you're changing the subject to a lesser thing, a thing that doesn't really exist, but you could have imagined it existing also. That would be greater. That's the thing. We said the greatest. You're changing the subject from the greatest thing to a lesser thing. We're not talking about that lesser thing. We're talking about the greatest thing. But the greatest thing, it's greater to exist than not to exist. So stop imagining a thing that's lesser than the thing we were talking about. Certainly, this cannot be, he says. There exists, therefore, beyond doubt, something than which a greater cannot be imagined, both in the understanding and in reality. Now, if you feel like somebody just played a shell game with you, spot the queen, something like that, I don't think so. It feels that way when you first hear this argument, but I don't think so. I've looked at this for a while. I think there's actually something to it. What this argument accomplishes would force you to say that the notion of the greatest thing it's possible to imagine is an incomprehensible impossibility, an incoherence, or it definitely exists. He's left no middle ground for doing what Aquinas wants to do, which is go and examine the world and see if you can find evidence for God's existence. He says we don't need to do that. If you and I both agree that these words mean something, right? That's all we have to agree is what we're talking about. It's obvious to anybody who examines the idea that we're talking about that it necessarily has existence as a part of it. Because we're talking about the greatest thing, the thing you can't imagine anything greater than. But if you can imagine it not existing, you also could imagine it existing. which would be greater than the other thing you're imagining, which doesn't really exist in reality. But why'd you change the subject to something you can think and imagine a greater than? We were talking about the thing you cannot imagine anything greater than. So don't change the subject. Stick to the subject. Look at the definition, something greater than which you cannot imagine. There's something to this, but it's not exactly clear what it is because it'd be very easy right now to say, okay, you're playing a word game. It's a very clever word game, but it's kind of like a Parmenidean paradox. Like it's something wrong with it. It's easy to feel that way, but there are ideas in our minds, certain philosophers have pointed out, that it doesn't make sense for us to have in our minds unless there is a divine. Everything you've ever experienced is limited. It comes into being and goes out of being. It requires other things as the explanation for its existence. It's contingent, as Aquinas pointed out. You have erred before and been limited and wrong and deceived. You aren't all powerful and all knowing and simple at the same time, just simply perfect and without parts. You're not anything like that, and nothing around you has ever been anything like that. So, how do you have an idea like that in your head? Descartes would say. Where'd that idea come from? How can it possibly be? Like I can imagine a gold mountain, but I've interacted with gold and I've interacted with mountains. So I can just sort of stick the two together. There are no unicorns, but there's horned creatures, horned mammals, and there's horses, and I can sort of put the two together. But there's nothing in the cosmos that is qualitatively like the idea that once you start examining it of what the divine is like. You can't just make up the imprint of that notion in your mind unless you've interacted with it to some degree, unless maybe it left its fingerprint on you when it created you. I mean, there has to be something like that out in the cosmos, even for the imprint of it to be upon your mind. So, this is a category of argument for God's existence that Aquinas wants to throw away. He says, nah, don't play those games. Don't play those games. Let's just stick to science. And this way, we'll examine the world and we'll come to conclusions about what must be true of God from looking at the rest of the world. But there's this weird group of platonically inclined thinkers who say, why should I go get out of bed? Why do I have to go examine and explore the world and collect data? I've just got the quality of the ideas in my mind already. I could just start there. Why don't I look inward and say, what must be true of the cosmos if I, as a thinking thing, exist? Even if I'm a brain in a vat, constantly being deceived by infinite demons in a matrix or something like that, it doesn't matter. Forget looking out there. I don't know if I can trust any of that. What's in here? What's in here that I can't deny? Well, Descartes says, well, even if I doubt everything, the proposition I am doubting can't be doubted by me without affirming it. If I'm doubting, I'm doing a thinking thing. So I'm thinking. And if I'm thinking, I, as a deceivable thinking thing, exist whenever I put forward the idea. Okay. I don't seem to be able to doubt that. Okay, what other ideas are in my head? Well, I have ideas that I'm seeing things, but sometimes I'm dreaming and I'm being deceived, so I don't know if I'm really seeing things. I have ideas about mathematics, but maybe I'm a code in a simulation and the system makes me do the sums wrong the same way every time, and so I never notice by the consistency of the error that I'm doing it incorrectly. I could just be being fooled by an all powerful demon all the time. I mean, I don't know if any of these ideas are reliable. Two plus two make four. It seems that way to me, but I really don't have any way to rely on that knowledge since all I know is I, as a deceiving thing, exist or a deceivable thing exist. But as he's digging around looking for ideas, Descartes comes to this idea. Wait a minute, hold on a second. Hold the phone. I'm deceived. I make errors. I'm limited. I'm not infinite and yet at the same time simple. I have parts. I'm contingent. I'm composed of other things. I come into being and go out of being. I don't have the necessary explanation for my existence within myself. I'm not anything like that. And neither is anything I've ever experienced even if I've never experienced anything, because it's I'm just stuck in a matrix. Descartes says, I don't know, maybe I've been dreaming my whole life. Maybe I'm in a coma my whole life. Maybe a demon has been deceiving me my whole life, even about mathematical truths. I can't trust any of those. But everything I've ever experienced and what I know myself to be is nothing like this other very strange idea that I just happen to have floating around in my brain. I found this notion. It's a weird idea. It's an idea of an all powerful, all knowing, simple, not made of parts, not embodied thing. This this divine idea is in my darn head, but I'm not like that. I didn't get it from looking at myself, and nothing else I've ever experienced is like that. Where did that idea come from? How could such an idea exist even in the mind of a dude plugged into the matrix? Where could that idea possibly have come from? And Descartes says there must be something like that. It's left its imprint on me. I know that I, as a thing that can be deceived, exist, and I know that God exists before I even know that there's a tree out my window when I seem to be looking at one because I've dreamed before, and that could be false. The physical world is not as real to me as the fact that I exist and God exists. Now, this is a category of arguments that Aquinas again has poo-pooed and said, don't go down that road. Not interested in finding things internally in your mind analytically, not interested in this Anselmian idea that it's self-evident that God exists. You just have to examine the nature of the idea itself, and you can come to an actual conclusion about something outside yourself, in the cosmos or out the cosmos, the divine. You can't be playing that game. Maybe, possibly, Aquinas gives a little lip service to. He says maybe for an extremely learned person, you could see clearly and follow that path, and it could lead you to some truth. But let's just examine the world. Remember, so we looked at 5 arguments, and in all of them, he starts out by saying, let's examine what's true about the world. Let's take for granted that all our knowledge comes through our senses, and let's just examine what the world is like and see what that tells us about whether or not there is a God. So he's already poo-pooed Anselm directly, right? I mean, if we go back here in his arguments, he says, oh, that's not the one. Here it is. He says, those things are said to be self-evident. This is the objector who's disagreeing with Aquinas. When as soon as the terms are known, now you can see why we highlighted so much the fact that Anselm is saying, you know what I'm saying. All you have to do is know the meaning of the words. You don't have to agree that God exists. Do you know the meaning of the words? Something than which it is not possible to imagine a greater. That's what I'm going to define God as. You agree we could define God that way, and then we could go and examine the world and see if he exists? And the atheist says, sure, yeah, that's a fine definition. I don't think that exists. And then Anselm says, no, wait a minute. You understand what I'm saying, right? I'm saying a thing greater than which you can't imagine. Yeah, no, I know, says the atheist. I don't think that exists. And Anselm says, no, wait, you do understand what those words mean, right? And he goes, yeah, I get it. Let's go examine the world and see if that exists. And Anselm says, why be so busy? Sit down. Think about what that means. Can you imagine that thing existing? Yes. Can you imagine it only in your mind, but not actually existing? Yes. Well, we're not talking about that. We're talking about the first one. That one's greater. You said you agreed to examine whether or not something so great you can't imagine something greater existing. And that's not the same thing as the thing that doesn't actually exist. You're imagining something lesser because you could imagine it actually existing. You said those words were meaningful. You understood what those words meant. As soon as you understood the terms and agreed to the terms, game over. We don't have to go and examine the world and see if that's true or not. It's in the terms. If I say to you, all bachelors are unmarried, and you say, well, let's examine that. I'm going to start a survey. We're going to go door to door. We're going to knock on doors. We're going to say, are there any bachelors living in this house? And if they say yes, we're going to say, we have a poll question for you. Are you married or not? He says, no. Okay, check mark. I'm going to keep going. I'm going to search the whole world over. We're going to do statistical analysis and discover whether or not it's true that all bachelors are unmarried. And the self-evident propositions like this, they don't require anything like that. What are you doing wasting your time? As soon as you know what the terms mean, you know that the statement is true. As soon as you know what the terms mean, it must be true. And Anselm is saying, yeah, that's like the existence of God. If you knew what you meant by God as something than which it is not possible to imagine a greater, even in your imagination, you can't imagine something greater than this. If you know what that means, you know that beyond a doubt, that thing exists. Why? We're talking about something you can't imagine anything greater than. Can you imagine that thing not existing? Yeah. Can you imagine it existing? Yeah. Isn't this one greater than that one? Yeah. So we're not talking about this one. We're not talking about the one that only exists in your mind but doesn't actually exist, because you can imagine something greater than that. That's the thing we were talking about. Why examine the world to discover if that's true? That just has to be true. Again, feels like a shell game. Feels like a where's the queen? Where's the red queen in the cards? It feels like that, but it might not be like that. There's another version of this kind of argument. So we looked at the Cartesian one, where he says there's the quality of the notion in my head that just can't have its explanation as something I dreamt up or something. uh, there just must be something out there like this, because I can't come up with crazy things that are not like myself or anything else I've ever experienced. That's not possible. And here it is. This idea is in my head. So there's another version of this argument, which is I had it in my head a second ago. It was based off of highlighting the idea that it's contained within the term of the notion of God. That, oh yeah, so what we're talking about clearly with Aquinas is something that necessarily exists. So now we can take the insights we get from these ontological arguments and we can go back to Aquinas, where he actually says, okay, I'm not going to do it that way. I don't think that really works. Maybe if you're very learned, perhaps, but it's not really good. Let's see if we can demonstrate the existence of God. Yes, I think we could. And then we did the video where we examined how he tries to do that, whether God exists, and he has arguments. Let's just look at one of the five again, really quickly, and see that what he's talking about is a necessary being, a thing that doesn't require anything else for its existence. Now, if you just examine that idea alone, something must be like that if there's anything. So Aquinas wants to do that this way. He wants to say, let me examine the world. Everything in the world is contingent. Everything in the world that I've ever experienced and myself comes into being and goes out of being. All right. It's like a thrown stone. It has its arc, but its explanation for why it is in the first place is all these other things. All these other things happen to allow it to be, and it did its thing, and then it made other things be. Everything is a domino knocking into a domino, knocking into a domino, all containing within themselves the efficient cause to knock over the next domino, and all of them being moved by a sufficient cause behind them, efficient enough to make them happen. But wait a minute, Aquinas says. Now he's starting on the grassroots level. He's saying, I'm going to examine scientifically and intellectually. I'm going to look at the world, and all my knowledge is going to come through my senses. And I'm going to say everything is like that. I've never found a thing that just has to be, for it is. It contains within itself the reason why it is. I've never found anything like that. But if everything requires something else, other factors in order to be, that I'm just looking at a chain of dominoes, QRST dominoes knocking into each other. And I'm saying, well, that can't go back forever. Not just temporally, it can't go back forever. That would be a weaker argument. Aquinas isn't even making that weaker argument. He's just saying you can't have that going back forever. Something has to knock over the first domino. There must be something not like that. There must be a prime mover. There must be something unlike everything I'm looking at, because here we are. Things are moving. Things are coming into being. Things have their sufficient explanation in other things. So there must be a God, because things are. In other words, everything exists, as Descartes said, in the mean between absolute being and nothingness. Well, then there's absolute being. If there wasn't, as Aquinas points out, everything could be or could not be and exist probabilistically. Well, if that goes back forever, if it goes back forever, there would be a time when there was nothing. There would be a time when the probabilistic chance ability for each thing to be would have been zero, where it would have just happened to flop into a nothing. And if everything flopped into a nothing, there would still be nothing because you can't get anything back again. If there's no dominoes knocking things over, you're not going to get new dominoes knocking things over. So that can't go back forever. There has to be a big bang, and there has to be a banger who banged it. That's what Aquinas is doing. These ontological arguers are going to start the other way. They're going to start from the top down. They're going to say, I don't have to go examine the world. I don't have to go and do that. Just I have access to a notion of the divine. I know that part of the definition of being God is not needing anything to be. You want me to go find a reason why it is now? Is that the inquiry we're going to do? Did you not listen to the definition? The thing necessarily is. It's being qua being. If you think that means something, and then you want to go examine the world to find out if it's true that that thing is, you're wasting your time. That's like asking people if they're bachelors and then asking them if they're unmarried. That's what it means to be a necessary being. It is necessarily, necessarily it is. And that's what we mean by God. What we mean by God is the thing that just has to be. And then therefore is the explanation for everything else being. So the ontological arguments that Aquinas wants to poo-poo and say, well, maybe for a few sophisticated people that could work, but I'm not really sold on that. And he wants to start investigating things. The way he's investigating things is leading him to a definition of the divine where the ontological arguers like Socrates and Descartes and Anselm are saying, no, just think about the idea for a second. That's more real than you are. That's got to be. What's your argument? You want us to go and see if that's real? You want me to go see if bachelors are unmarried? It's in the definition. And you have access to that idea. And Descartes cleverly points out there's no way you could have access to an idea like that since you're not like that and nothing you've ever experienced is like that. Right? You can imagine a golden mountain. You can imagine a unicorn and there not be a unicorn and there not be a golden mountain. But there's goldiness and there's mountain likeness and there's horned creatureness and there's horsiness, equestrian concepts. You have all of those and you can just mix and match them. That's fine. You could probably even imagine a horse mountain. That doesn't mean there's a horse mountain. But what you can't imagine is something that's not like anything you've ever experienced. But you can imagine an infinite, all powerful, necessary being, and that's not like anything you've ever experienced. Oops, unless it is. Unless God put his stamp of his fact of his existence on you that you might go and look for him. That's the only explanation. He must be out there. He must be out there and has left an imprint and a thumbprint of himself. And it's right there when you start examining the ideas. So again, Aquinas doesn't want to do that. He wants to examine the world and then find out that God exists. But what's interesting is that he ends up with a definition of God where the ontologists who he wanted to poo-poo are making arguments saying, just start with the idea, man. Why are you getting out of bed? It's too early for this. You're going to go examine the world and discover that everything is contingent and therefore must require an explanation for its. Come on, man. What is the idea we're trying to find if it exists or not? The thing greater than which it is not possible to imagine? Okay, I'm imagining that not existing right now. Ooh, I'm imagining it existing right now. Oh, that's greater. So the first idea is not the one we're talking about. We're talking about the second idea, and it exists. That's how Anselm makes his argument. And again, it sounds weird when you first hear it, but there's more to it than you imagine there is. We have to kind of maybe look at Descartes. We should actually look at the Socratic piece I wanted to look at as well. Let's see if that's here. Let's see if we can find that. Okay. Bum 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 bum. Here we go. So let's go back to Socrates. We did a lot in our last video, a lot, and it was really awesome. Thank you again, Roger, for all the Aristotelian stuff we got to look at. But let's let the Platonic voice step up for a quick second here. A great conversation in the Phaedo. Shall we proceed a step further and affirm that there is such a thing as equality, not of one piece of wood or stone with another? Here we are examining ideas in the world, but that over and above this, there is absolute equality. Do you think we should agree to that? "Uh, Say so. Yes, replied Simmias, and swear to it with all the confidence in life. Okay. So remember, Aquinas had said, how can we have, let's see if we can find this. Oops. Aquinas said, anyway, this was in the section on that we were just on a moment ago. Let's go down to that. Pum, pum, pum. Pum, 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 pum. Way down, down, doobie doo, down, down. Come down, doobie doo, down, down. Okay. Some are more and some are less good. Okay. Among beings, there are some more and some less good. True, noble, and the like. But more and less are predicated on different things, according as they may resemble their different ways, something which it has a maximum. Okay, so what some philosophers are pointing out is that you can't even use meaningfully the concepts of more and less unless you have within yourself a maximum that one thing is closer to than the other. Socrates is about to make that argument here. So Simmias has already agreed, sure, there's a maximum good, a maximum equality, a maximum whatever. What's the nature of this absolute essence? Whence did we obtain our knowledge? Did we not see equalities of material things, such as pieces of wood and stone, and gather from them the idea of an equality which is different from them? For you will acknowledge that there is a difference. Look at the matter another way. Do not the same pieces of wood and stone appear at one time equal and at another time unequal? So what Socrates, look, let's just paraphrase. We said this in the last one. Draw a 7 on a board, draw another 7 on a board, draw 4 on a board. And you might say, let's do this right here. Boom, chicka doom, chicka boom, 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 chicka boom, boom. Okay, here we go. So if someone were to, let's make this bigger, that'll be nice. Someone were to draw 7 and another 7 and a 4, and then ask you, because you're good philosophy students, hey, which two are the same? And everybody goes, ooh, I know, the first two, right? But they're not the same. There's nothing the same about either of these. I mean, they're really quite different. I'm not sure that there's even one bit of ink next to another bit of ink that's the same in these two, if we really examine them. I mean, what if I drew that and I drew that? I mean, those two are definitely the same, right? But there's never, ever, ever, this is Socrates' point. There's never, not once, not once in the entire history of your life when you came screaming into this world till now, have you ever, once, ever encountered two things that were actually the same? So how the hell do you have access to that idea? How is that idea even in your brain? Says Socrates. This is one of the weirder pieces to understand. So I'm going to paraphrase a lot of it so that we can really understand it. Mhm. So let's see how he says all that. Are they not kind of the same, but kind of not the same? Well, that's certain. But are real equals ever unequal? I mean, right? Or is the idea of equality the same as the idea of inequality? Oh, that's impossible, Socrates. Well, then, These so called equals are not the same with the idea of equality. I should say, clearly not, Socrates. Good on you for pointing that out. And then Socrates says, and yet, from these equals, these things that are supposedly the same, even though you know they're not, although differing from the idea of equality, you think that's where you got your idea of equality from? You got it from things that weren't like that? Very true, he said. Which might be like or might be unlike them. Yeah, but that makes no difference. Whenever from seeing one thing you conceive another, whether like or unlike, there must surely have been an act of recollection. It's very true. So he's seeing the point. He's saying, wait a minute. I came to this world already knowing what sameness was. I didn't experience it. There's nothing, I've never experienced it. I came and I brought that idea with me. That came from another realm, says Socrates. Once you die, you're born again. But when you die, you enter the world of the oneness, sameness, absolute unity with the divine thing, and God's fingerprint is put on you. And that's the only explanation for how you can go around and say, look, I found two sticks that are the same. They're not the same. They're in different locations. They're composed of a different number of molecules. They have a slightly different shape. One of them came from an elm, and what? I mean, why are those two the same? Well, they're the same. They both look like guns. They both look like spears. They were both found over here. I don't know. They're the same. Socrates says, "Have you ever sat down and thought, little fish, how strange the water you're swimming in really is? You've got divine notions in your head and you're using them and you didn't even notice. You thought you came to those ideas by looking at things that are not the same and you came to the idea of sameness that way? How could you have done that? You only, and he has, just like Aquinas, an empirical commitment. He says you only know things through your experience. But in this life, you've never experienced sameness. So you must have been around somewhere before you were born. And you must have been in a realm where divine absolutes were the rule, and you encountered ultimate absolute sameness, and you came here with that memory, and you started projecting it on things. You started utilizing it to evaluate, oh, this thing's good, but this thing's even better. How do you know unless there's an absolute good and you're saying which one's closer to it? You used to know that thing. So Socrates is doing that same ontological thing that Aquinas doesn't want to do, by the way, but that Anselm is doing and that Descartes is doing. And he's saying there's the imprint of divinity within you if you would just be careful enough to think about the way you're using ideas. The consequence just from examining the ideas, not from examining the things in the world, just starting there, there's something unlike this world and you know something of it. And it's how you make sense of this world. It's like that famous C.S. Lewis quote that gets used too much. I believe in God not only because, like I believe in the sun, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. Right. But that's what Socrates is saying. He's saying, oh, I'm not trying to mock C.S. Lewis. It's sometimes hard. Anyway, we'll talk about that later. So, um, this is why you should never have a popular following. It makes people annoyed with you, even though they shouldn't be. So, Socrates is saying you have these divine notions and you're utilizing them all the time and you just don't notice because it's the water you're swimming in. But if you actually thought about it, you would realize that the world is nothing like sameness to even give you the idea of sameness to utilize in the first place. And so the fact that you can make judgments that one thing is better than another, one thing is more holy than another, one thing is more the same, two things are more the same as each other than these other two things, all of those ideas are only available to you because there is a divine realm and it has imprinted itself on you in one way or another. So those are ontological arguments. And again, we're talking about these to supplement what we've been doing with Aquinas because Aquinas poo-pooed these arguments. He said, look, I'm going to go examine the world and I'll demonstrate that God exists. But, this self-evident thing, maybe. He says maybe. He says maybe for some very, very clever, Very well learned people who really know what words mean, perhaps. But come on, you're not winning any converts that way. And it's a little bit much to ask people to be that intellectual. And why don't we just see if it's possible to examine the world and find that God exists? Can we demonstrate that God exists? And he says, I think we can. And then he goes about doing it. And he does it in his 5 ways. So what we're doing today is reading little excerpts of things that either appear in objections, right? Because Aquinas makes this argument. We didn't even look at it that long here, whether or not it be self-evident. His objector here is Anselm. And Anselm is saying the opposite of what Aquinas wants to say. Anselm is saying, yo, just look at the ideas, man. God must be. All right. So as soon as you understand the terms, as soon as the terms are known, you saw that in Anselm's argument. You understand what I mean when I say a being greater than which it is not possible to imagine. Yes, I certainly do. Anselm, I know what that means, but I don't think that exists. And Anselm says, what a foolish thing to say. Are you sure you understand what those words mean? Because if you understood what they mean, you would know that that has to exist. What? That's crazy. We should go examine the world and try to find evidence and then weigh it pro and con and then decide if God exists. Anselm says, why would we do that? I wouldn't do that if you asked me to prove that all bachelors were unmarried. The darn words mean what the darn words mean. So as soon as the terms are known, something is known to be true. And that's true of first principles of demonstration. This is why, again, Descartes, who also made this argument, is saying the point of my philosophy, says Descartes, is not to prove that trees exist and that math works and stuff. No, nobody but a crazy person would ever doubt that. The point of my philosophical book is to prove that you don't know those things as solidly as you know that you exist as a thing that is limited and can be deceived, and that God exists, a thing which has no reason to deceive. You can't know any of those other things until you know those two first. They're the foundation of being able to know anything. And you know them without relying upon your senses because you still can't trust those because you could be in a matrix, he says very clearly. So that's a category of thinker that all fits into Aquinas's objector here. And he says, come on. Don't play a shell game with people. Don't try to tell them that the word God just means it must exist. They're not going to buy that. But these other thinkers are like, no, I really want to, like Parmenides, I want to wrestle with what the idea means and then come to conclusions through that. And Aquinas is like, come on, we've got to be a bit more Aristotelian than that. We should be a little more let's examine the world sort of way. All right. So once again, the puppet objector of Anselm that Aquinas is bringing up here would say, thus, when the nature of a whole and of a part is known, it is at once recognized that every whole is greater than its part. But as soon as the signification of the word God is understood, it is at once seen that God exists. For by this word is signified that thing than which nothing greater can be conceived. And now we can see why Aquinas is saying all of this. He's making Anselm his objector and his opponent. But that which actually exists and mentally exists is greater than that which only exists mentally. Therefore, since as soon as the word God is understood, it exists mentally, it also follows that it exists actually. Now this is very interesting quality of all of these arguments as we've looked at Descartes and as we looked at Socrates and the way that Aquinas is phrasing Anselm here. What's interesting is they are actually sort of examining something in the cosmos to prove that God exists, but that thing they're examining is this, something that's in here. They found an idea that could, if it can exist mentally, if the idea really can exist. And Descartes says, look, search yourself and see if you have this notion. Maybe you don't. I searched my mind and I had this really weird idea. This really weird idea that there could be something all powerful and all knowing. I know I'm not like that never lies and makes no mistakes and is all good. And here's the kicker, has no parts. There's no north and south. There's no justice and mercy. It's one thing. We attribute justice, we attribute mercy, but he's just one thing somehow, and no location and no body. And what the heck? Nothing I've ever experienced is anything like that. How'd that idea get in there? That's what Descartes is saying. How'd that idea get in there? There's something about that idea that it shouldn't even be able to exist unless there's a God, unless there's something like that that has somehow imprinted the fact of his existence upon his creation that we might seek him and know him. That could explain it. But there, or as Plato says, you go into the realm of the divine after you die and you become reunified in oneness and sameness with all. And now you have the notions of all these ideas in that absolute divine, absolute form. And then you come back as a particular thing and you're born into the world again and you're like trying to make sense of particulars and everything is contingent again. But while you're looking around, you're saying, ooh, look at this. This and this, they're different. But these 2 are the same. I mean, Socrates goes, "What? You just said these 2 are the same? Um, if they were the same box, they're not the same. They're in 2 different locations. The amount of printing is, I mean, we could really examine them. There's nothing the same. You've never experienced anything the same while you've been living. How'd you get that idea? That's a weird idea for you to have," says Socrates. And his only explanation is, there's a realm of absolutes. There's a realm that you've encountered, and that's how there's an imprint of that inside your brain. There's no other way because of an empirical commitment. This is what's amazing about these ontologists, an empirical commitment that they can only know things through experience. That's explicitly, as I used to be able to do impressions when I was younger and my mind was more plastic, Zizek, explicitly. They say it in the text explicitly. It's the fact that you have the idea in your mind. Oops. What? Why is that not being shared? There we go. It's the fact that the idea is in your mind. He's spending more time saying you understand the idea. The idea exists in your mind. And Socrates is doing the exact same thing. How did you get this idea? You couldn't have gotten this idea by looking at things that are unequal to understand what's closer to absolute equal unless you've experienced. He actually says this. I don't know where. I, experience. For no one can have any experience of it all. Experience without any experience of human nature. Experience would have taught him the state of the case. Experiences have experienced these matters. I know he says it explicitly. Explicitly, he says it in this dialogue. He says all of our knowledge comes to us through our experience, and so that's a very interesting. You would think that maybe they wouldn't say something like that because you would imagine that they're saying, "Ooh, the realm of ideas. I don't want to be so scientific and have to." Excuse me. Have to start out by examining the world. But it's actually their radical empirical commitment to saying you can't have notions unless you've encountered and impressions have been made on your mind of things like that. You can think of gold mountains and you can think of unicorns and you can think of mountain horses, I guess, if you want. But that's only because you've had impressions of horses and impressions of mountains and impressions of gold. You've had impressions of horned creatures. But you can't just come up with something that's not the result of your experience. But then these Platonic thinkers start looking around for what ideas they have, and they realize, holy mackerel, some of these ideas, which I can only have if something's impressed upon me. I found gold and I know what goldness is. So I can imagine a gold mountain or a gold castle. Those don't exist, but I've had the impression of gold and I have had the impression of castles. So I can imagine gold castle. But where'd this idea come from? I've had no experience since I was born of sameness. Where did I get that from? I've had no experience at all of things that don't require anything to explain their existence, of non contingent necessary beings. How do I have that idea? Where did that come from? Oh, that's easy. There's a God, and I've experienced him somehow. He's imprinted himself upon me in some way. It must be true. Look at this weird idea. Where'd that come from? So, at first, if you think there's a set of arguments that say, well, God must exist because I have an idea, you must think, wow, that's crazy. But even Aquinas says, perhaps for a few very learned people who know how to really think through things, maybe that could work. But then Aquinas doesn't want to do that. And he says, we'll put that aside and we'll do this other thing instead. So we're doing this video and the video before The video we did before was all mostly about Aristotle, because we're looking at the physics and the metaphysics and basically seeing that Aquinas has a copy paste button and really, really, like a good scholastic, thought like Aristotle and thought like an Aristotelian. That's what they did. They basically, well, hey, Aristotle's the man. When he cites Aristotle, he says the philosopher. But we got to see just how true that was, and it was pretty impressively true. Thank you, Roger. But today, what we're doing is we're supplementing by looking at some of the objections and bringing a little bit of the Platonic voice into this. We'll finish this video by doing that. I've got a few more things we might look at. In fact, why don't we look at this one right now? That's a bit heavy, but we can look at that one. Okay, we'll go through a few more things. There's a few more pieces. I mean, Aquinas, what's amazing about this is how much Aquinas is pulling pre-Socratics and Aristotle and Plato and Socrates, as we just saw, and William James and Kierkegaard and all the from the past and from the future. He's pulling all these people in real time into a tent and then having them argue with each other through through his writing. That really is happening, right? One of his objections to the idea that you could demonstrate that God exists, which is what he wants to do. He wants to examine and weigh evidence and demonstrate that God exists. He says one of the objections to that is the idea that that would abolish any reason for faith. Well, that's William James, isn't it? So we might read a little William James and say, okay, in the objector who's talking, that's William James. Came, I don't know, it came like 800 years later, but Aquinas understood the idea. He's going to understand Mill, he's going to understand Kant. All those ideas are present right in this one text, which is one of the things we wanted to see while we read this, and we're seeing it more and more. So let's go back to this over here and say, what other bits of philosophy can we supplement? So we're going to do this second video supplementing everything we've done in the first two treatises as we've read through them and seen those arguments with other pieces of philosophy. And then what we're going to do, stuff that we look at that stuff at greater depth in other classes. But then what we're going to do is we're going to have Tartaglia back to argue against, well, I'll play Aquinian advocate, and he's going to argue against the entire first treatise. So the first treatise of Aquinas is saying, yeah, we're going to do philosophy. Let's base everything on human reason. That sounds great. But I think it's legitimate to look for revealed truth because, as you'll see later, there is a God and he wants us to know him and he has to descend to us in order for us to know him. So it would make sense that somewhere there might be revealed truth and they might have to argue it out and work out what it is. But let the priests and the poets do that because that would be a legitimate means of getting to truth. And while what we're going to do is philosophy, we'll just base everything on human reason, but we're going to use human reason to argue, hey, that game's legit too. In fact, it might even be a little nobler than what we're doing. And maybe we can get to some of the same truths, but maybe not all. And who knows? So that was his whole first treatise, is just saying, yeah, that's legit. You can do that too, but I'm going to do philosophy here. But Tartaglia is going to come in and bring up some really important objections and say, now, wait a minute, that's dangerous. It's dangerous to start letting faith into this whole thing. I think you've got to stick with reason and reason only. Let's put reason on the throne. There shouldn't be anything higher than that. So we're gonna argue back and forth about that. So that's something he and I have discussed for well over 15 years now. And the conversation gets better every time we have it. And so we'll have it again. And then we'll get into the third treatise again. So for now, let's just continue what we've been doing. Oh, I forgot. I forgot the most important thing to do. If you're here, you haven't missed it. Get your mug, your cup, your tankard, your chalice, your thermos, your stein, your canteen, your jug, your flask, your vessel of any kind, and fill it with your favorite liquid. I'm going to drink some water today. And join me now for the unparalleled pleasure, the thing that makes it really makes everything better. The dopamine hit of the day. It's called the simultaneous sip, and feel this simultaneity as it happens right now. Go. Ah, ooh, chills. You feel the chills? That's how simultaneity works. That's the power of simultaneity right there. Okay. So let's continue what we've been doing here. Whether the existence of God is self-evident. So we might move past that now and say, let's look at some of the objections to the idea that you could even argue for God's existence. It seems that the existence of God cannot be demonstrated, for it's an article of faith that God exists. But what is of faith cannot be demonstrated because a demonstration produces scientific knowledge, whereas faith is of the unseen. Therefore, it cannot be demonstrated that God exists. So, this is a reason based argument that the objector gives to Aquinas. Aquinas is writing it, of course, but saying, I already know you can't succeed at this, Aquinas. If you're going to set out, as you are, to give us an argument that proves that God exists, you can't, because I know he exists. And I know that he would never want an argument that proves he exists to exist, because that would abolish the need for faith. And that's what pleases God. So give it up before you start, buddy. That's a bad idea. If you could prove that God existed, you should shut up and not tell anybody, because it's going to ruin their chances of actually knowing the divine. Strange idea, but not without some merit. So let's see if we can find. I don't know if I have the right passage from William James here. I might have. Oh, come on. It must be in here. Let's see. Let's give it a shot. We did the simultaneous sip, so it'll be better than I think it was. Let's see. Boom, boom, boom. Oh, that's a good one. It's going to be here. Okay, there's a similar reasoning process. Is it count? You can't prove it one way, you can't prove it another. How do you move forward philosophically? That's William James on free will, which is useful and worth reading because it shows the way of thinking. But gosh, it's so close to what we want. Where's my? I've got other sources here. Un momento, por favor. Okay, I think what we might do is skip reading that. It's a bit heavy, and we have something else that's heavy coming up. There's other fideists, and so I was looking at a fideist as a person who is arguing philosophically that faith is relevant, necessary, should be the grounding of things, maybe is the ultimate. And some of them are a bit heavy, and I don't know. Well, we're here to read books that punch us in the gut, right? So let's see if the book destroys me while I read it. It's pretty heavy. So let's talk about this. Kierkegaard wrote a book called Fear and Trembling. Kierkegaard's book called Fear and Trembling focuses a lot on Abraham's willingness to sacrifice Isaac. And what Kierkegaard concludes is that being a good person is not enough. He could maybe possibly imagine living the knight of nobility's life where he sacrifices himself for something greater than himself and all of this. But he could never possibly act on faith. And it seems like that's what's needed existentially. So he says, now hold on a second. I'm in a lot of trouble here because if God told me to do that, I wouldn't be able to do it. But I recognize that it is the thing I should do in that setting. So woe is me. And he's full of fear and trembling as a result because he recognizes how little faith he has. Um, that's fideism. It's not exactly the objection that was being raised, though. So I feel as though it would be too much of a tangent to go into. He says, look at Abraham. Abraham is getting lots of things from God. It's like he's a selfish person again. He's no longer noble and sacrificial in the sense of, he actually wants things from God and he's making a deal with God. And it's so strange because it's a second movement out of present moment hedonism to the nobility. And then this second movement back over and higher again to this place of being where you actually are concerned with yourself to some degree. And he just doesn't think he can make that second move. And so it fills him with fear and trembling. Abraham, I cannot understand. That's what he says here. I'll just read a paragraph. In a certain sense, there's nothing I can learn from him but astonishment. If people fancy that by considering the outcome of this story, they might let themselves be moved to believe, they deceive themselves and want to swindle God out of the first movement of faith, the infinite resignation. They would suck worldly wisdom out of the paradox. Perhaps one or another may succeed in that, for our age is not willing to stop with faith, with its miracle of turning water into wine. It goes further. It turns wine into water. Hmm. Would it not be better to stop with faith? And is it not revolting that everybody wants to go further? Okay, so there's this funny meme we talked about the other day. I think that Roger made it for us because we couldn't find it. Let's see here. What are you? Let's see. It might be in here somewhere. Okay, we'll find it right over here. I should have sent that link. I'm sorry. I'll send it to you in a moment. Do in the morning, baby. Oh, what a glorious thing. Get to have the whole day. Hey, oh. Here it is. Okay, he made a version for us. Let's see if we can share that right quickly. We're getting off track, and I'll get us back on track rapidly enough. But let's see. Open link in new tab. Not link. There it is. Okay. Open image in new tab. All right, there we go. Okay, so this is oh, I'm not sharing anything. There we go. This is the meme. Okay. It's not exactly fair and perfect or right, but it's a heck of a meme. So you've seen the type of meme where it's sunny on one side and cliffs on another. But this is the Kierkegaard that we're talking about here. It's too far afield from what we actually mean to discuss. I tell you what, here's the best bit we can read. This is a similar philosophical logical move made by William James, and it's light enough for us to read and relevant to uh, the objection. So we're going to read this instead. Um, as we mentioned in the backbone course of the first year material, all the philosophical concepts are related to each other. And we've already seen that a little bit in this video with what Socrates was talking about and how relevant it was, even though it seemed to be about something different. We're going to give William James the chance to speak up a little bit because boom, boom, share screen, Aquinas. Where'd it go? Too many links. Okay, because one of the objections, again, not sharing, there we go. One of the objections that we had before Aquinas could make an argument that God exists is that there should be no such argument because it would abolish all reason for faith, and that this thing is really supposed to be about faith. So, what we will do is we will read a person who says, look, okay, here's the deal. What if a specific question like God's existence or do you have free will or something like that? What if not only has no one on either side of that debate been able to give us a knockdown argument, but what if philosophically we could figure out that there could be no knockdown argument on either side? What should we do then? And what William James says, and he'll use a different example than the existence of God, though you'll see how relevant it is while we're reading through it. What he says is let's take a question like that, determinism and free will, and let's prove that there is no way for either side to make a knockdown argument. So we just don't know. And then what we should do after that is not just give up and ignore it because the question still matters to us. What we should do instead is use honesty and reason to examine the philosophical implications of believing either one, and then acknowledging that it's a prejudice on our part, not pretending that it actually leads to a reason why we have to agree with one side or the other. or reject one side or the other. Let's be as honest as we can in examining our own psychological motivations for preferring the consequences of believing one side or the other. We should do all of that. We shouldn't just be lazy and say, well, we don't have an answer, so let's just move on. This actually matters in how we think of ourselves and the world. So let's see if we can look at that thought process by William James, because I couldn't find, I'm sure it's here somewhere, but I couldn't find the excerpt I wanted from William James directly on this concept. But you'll see that he's giving us room for believing without reason, one of the definitions of faith, right? And beyond that, saying you have a will to believe, you have a necessity to think one thing or the other, even if philosophically you can demonstrate that you couldn't know either side. So let's just read the sections of this Dilemma of Determinism by William James that are relevant to this: rationality and the free will controversy, possibilities and actualities, the idea of chance, moral implications of determinism. Morality and indeterminism. All right, so we want to see the full argument, but we're not going to read the entire essay. We're going to look for the right paragraphs here. A common opinion prevails that the juice has ages ago been pressed out of the free will controversy, and that no new champion can do more than warm up stale arguments which everyone has heard. This is a radical mistake. I know of no subject less worn out, or in which inventive genius has a better chance of breaking open new ground, not perhaps of forcing a conclusion or of coercing assent, but of deepening our sense of what the issue between the two parties really is, and of what the idea of fate and of free will imply. So it's ironic, but it's humorously interesting for him to say, because he's going to come down on the free will side, I don't want to have a knockdown argument that proves you have free will, because then you won't be able to be free to believe determinism anymore. And I want you to be free to believe determinism because I believe in free will. So, phew, luckily, I'm going to have a lot to say, genius invention perhaps, and we're going to explore the psychological and moral contentions and what's really at stake here. And we're going to learn a lot of new things. But what I'm not going to do is show up and give you a knockdown argument for free will. That would be horrible. If I could prove that you have free will, you kind of would have less freedom because you'd be forced to believe it. I mean, if I show you that the sum of the angles of a triangle lead to 180, you don't really have the freedom not to know that anymore. You're kind of just stuck knowing it. So luckily, I don't have a knockdown argument for free will, but as we shall soon see, no one has a knockdown argument for either side. And that's great because you're free to believe whichever you like. At our very side, almost, in the past few years, we have seen falling in rapid succession from the press works that present the alternative in entirely novel lights. Okay. Not to speak of the English disciples of Hegel, such as Green and Bradley, not to speak of how completely changed and refreshed the disputes. I cannot pretend to vie in originality with any of these masters I have named, and my ambition limits itself to just one little point. If I can make two of the necessary implied corollaries of determinism clearer to you than they have been made before, I shall have made it possible for you to decide for or against that doctrine with a better understanding of what you are about. Notice these existentialists and phenomenologists, and Nietzsche said, "I've been a psychologist all along." They're judging the philosophy by the philosopher, and they're judging the philosopher by the philosophy. Okay, that they're no longer allowing themselves or anybody else to pretend that they are in some ethereal realm pronouncing rational reasons for things. They're saying, I'm a creature with motivations, and you can learn about what type of creature I am by the way I say things and what I choose to think. And that's also true of you. We're not going to ignore your good reasons for things. If you give us good reasons for something, we're going to still be rational and philosophical, but we're not going to ignore all of that dimension at the same time. So He wants you to know more about yourself and what you are about when you decide with determinism or with free will by making clearer what the implications are of believing either. He's saying exactly what we said he would be saying. Okay. If you prefer not to decide at all, but to remain doubters, you will at least see more plainly what the subject of your hesitation is. No one escapes. I thus disclaim openly on the threshold all pretension to prove to you that the freedom of will is true. The most I hope is to induce some of you to follow my own example in assuming it true and acting as if it were true. If it be true, it seems to me that this is involved in the strict logic of the case. Its truth ought not to be forced willy nilly down our indifferent throats. It ought to be freely espoused by men who can equally well turn their backs upon it. This is a beyond proof or disproof realm. It's a beyond good or evil realm, right? He's like, look, just admit you can't. Well, he's going to demonstrate why you can't prove either one. Um, but one of the similarities from what we're talking about with this Aquinas objection here is he wants there not to be a proof either way. Not only have we spent centuries not proving either side, but he wants there not to be a demonstration. This objector is saying to Aquinas, don't go about trying to prove God exists. There'd be no room for faith anymore. This question is the type of question that William James is noticing is also true of free will and determinism. It's characterological. It says a lot about you, which you choose to believe, if you're educated enough to know that you're not compelled to believe either. Let's keep reading. This is quite relevant. So although it wasn't my first choice, it's quite relevant. So we're going to keep going. With thus much understood at the outset, we can advance, but not without one more point being understood as well. The arguments I am about to urge all proceed on two suppositions. First, that we make theories about the world and discuss them with one another, that when we do that, we do so in order to attain a conception of things which shall give us subjective satisfaction. And second, if there be two conceptions, and the one seems to us on the whole more rational than the other, we are entitled to suppose that the more rational one is the truer of the two. Let's pause. There's some reasons why Tartaglia might quarrel with this, especially the first half of that. And there might be good reason to quarrel with this. I'm reminded of what Scott Adams taught us. He says, your brain is a delusion generating machine. This is not what William James is saying. But he's saying your brain is a delusion generating machine on everything. So what you should do is take all the things you want to think are true and weigh them on two scales. One, does it make me happy to believe it? And two, does it allow me to predict more accurately what's going to happen? That's the closest you can get to measuring whether or not it's true and useful. He didn't just say, does it help you to predict, which would be a pragmatic, there's many schools of thought where that would be a definition of getting closer to the truth. William James is saying, okay, on this question, that's the case. Maybe not on all questions. For Scott Adams, the hypnotist, he says, now I know how your mind works. It's all questions. That's just what you are. But William James is saying on this question, that's the case. And what you need to do is ask yourself, what does it do to your disposition, to your ability to engage and embrace life, or to curl up in a circle and hide from life? What is it? Is it life affirming what it does for you to believe it? So there's all sorts of ways we might judge that. Does it make you happy? Is a cartoonish way of phrasing that. And the second one is, if it's more reasonable, let's read this carefully and see what he's saying. Uh, if there be two conceptions, and the one seems to us, on the whole, more rational than the other, we are entitled to suppose the more rational one is truer of the two. It's not clear if what he's saying is it would be more rational to believe it because of its consequences, or it's more rational, even though it's not a knockdown argument that can actually end it. So we'll have to see what he says, what he really means about that. I hope that you are all willing to make these assumptions with me, for I am afraid that if there be any of you here who are not, they will find little edification in the rest of what I have to say. I cannot stop to argue the point, but I myself believe that all the magnificent achievements of mathematical and physical science, our doctrines of evolution, of uniformity of law, and the rest proceed from our indomitable desire to cast the world into a more rational shape. So he meant it in the more absolute sense of rational in our minds than the shape into which it is thrown there by the crude order of our experience. The world has shown itself to a great extent plastic to the demand of ours for rationality. How much further it will show itself plastic, no one can say. Our only means of finding out is to try. And I, for one, feel as free to try conceptions of moral as of mechanical or of logical rationality. Okay, so he's saying that this is just the standard for all truth, physics. Which one makes more sense? Go with the one that makes more sense. Fine, but also of ethics. So he's going to apply it to the consequences for how I orient myself in the world and whether or not more goodness or less goodness comes out of my believing one or the other. Okay. If a certain formula for expressing the nature of the world violates my moral demand, aha, okay, he's even going to say, look, if the consequence of believing an idea that you did not prove was true to me, that I'm still open to believe the other side, even though that side didn't prove it's true to me, because that's going to be the framework for all this. If the consequence of that is outrageous to my moral attitude, I don't want to be in a world like that. And I don't have to believe I am because you don't have a knockdown argument that I have to believe that. It's just a matter of what you are preferring to believe. I have every right, he says, to just reject it and say, I choose not to believe it. Now, he's setting up the rules for his own game here. And he's saying, if you don't agree with these rules, you're not going to like the rest of what I have to say. But I think I have a right to reject an idea that isn't proven to me if I examine the philosophical consequences of it and it is unacceptable to me that it be true. You might disagree with that. You might say, that's not a good enough reason to reject an idea. But William James thinks it is. Uh, Not all ideas, right? William James isn't saying if you don't like the consequences of an obviously true idea that's been demonstrated for you, you have a right not to believe it. He's not saying that. You have to believe that idea. That idea is true. So you have to believe it, tough it out, find a way to make peace with it, come to terms with it, whatever. So he's not saying just believe whatever you like. He's saying on questions where you cannot prove either side, and neither side has an argument that can force someone on the other side to come over to the side they're on. It's actually a matter of psychological disposition, which side you end up on. If that's the case, you don't just say, well, flip a coin, I'll believe whatever. You say, let me examine all of the consequences of believing that idea, not just the consequences of the idea, but of believing it, and determine if I think some of those are undesirable. And I have a moral right to say that's ugly. It would be an uglier world if I believed that idea, not just because the idea seems ugly to me, but because the way I would live would be uglier and it would be a worse world. So I reject it. I have no compulsion to accept it. You haven't proven to me it's true. I reject it on those grounds alone. Now, it would be nice, maybe some philosophers think, if you had a knockdown argument why it's not true. But this is the type of question William James is setting up, where he says nobody has that on either side. And he'll demonstrate why. So we should get to that. If a certain formula for expressing the nature of the world outrages, violates my moral demand, I shall feel free to throw it overboard or at least to doubt it, as if it disappointed my demand for uniformity of sequence, for example. The one demand being, so far as I can see, quite as subjective and emotional as the other is. We're not going to get into all of this now, but we will later. This is some stuff we're going to dive into really deeply in another class. It's not relevant to Aquinas right now, so we won't, or not directly to what we've read so far anyway. The principle of causality, for example, what is it but a postulate? An empty name covering simply a demand that the sequence of events shall someday manifest a deeper kind of belonging of one thing with another than the mere juxtaposition which now phenomenally appears. We might not be able to read sentences like that without actually diving into them. But this is pretty radical. Why don't we skip to the part where he demonstrates that neither side has an argument? That's a cool idea, by the way. That's a hot rocking cool idea. We'll be getting into it deeply in year 3, but we're doing some year 2 material right now, and it's not relevant to what we're looking at. He's going to deal with chance, hard determinism. Old-fashioned determinism was what we may call hard determinism. It did not shrink from such words as fatality, bondage of the will, necessitation, and the like. Nowadays, we have a soft determinism which abhors such harsh words and repudiating fatality, necessity, and even predetermination says that its real name is freedom. For freedom is only necessity understood. That's the compatibilists. We've looked at that in our year 1 material. So you can go back and find those old videos. Bondage to the highest is identical with true freedom. Even a writer of this, so he's just rehearsing what people have had here. But where is the part where he demonstrates that neither side can have an argument? Determinism, on the contrary, says they exist nowhere in the necessity in the hand of possibility. Soul categories are possibilism of the issue. The issue, it will be seen, is a perfectly sharp one, which no eulogistic terminology can smear over or wipe out. The truth must lie with one side or the other, and its lying with one side makes the other false. Okay, so he tries to say this is not a false problem. There's the pseudo problemists and the compatibilists who try to wipe away this problem. We won't read it all, but William James is saying, no, it's a real problem. You're either determined or you are free. This is a real problem. Philosophers are right to pick a side, but we don't have an argument for why we have to pick one specific side. So what are we going to do? The question relates solely to the existence of possibilities. Okay, here we go. In the strict sense of the term, as things that may, but need not be, real possibilities, right? Both sides admit that a violation, for instance, has occurred. The indeterminists say another violation might have occurred in its place. I'm so sorry. A volition. A person chose something. Okay. Both sides admit that a volition, for instance, has occurred. The indeterminists say another volition might have occurred in its place. The determinists swear that nothing could possibly have occurred in its place. Now, can science be called in to tell us? Here we go. Can science be called in to tell us which of these two point blank contradictors of each other is right? Science professes to draw no conclusions, but such as are based on matters of fact, things that have actually happened. But how can any amount of assurance that something actually happened give us the least grain of information as to whether another thing might or might not have happened? Qualitatively, by definition, the rules of doing science preclude it from entering this realm and giving us an answer. The way you do science is by pointing to facts. The question before us is, could something else have happened? Science can't look at that. It has to only tell us about the things that happened. So, by definition, our science will never be able to tell us, yes, something else could have happened. There's free will. You could have made a different choice. And likewise, science cannot tell us, no, nothing else could possibly have happened. Because all science can point to is what happened. It's going to describe what happened and give you the likelihood of other things happening, perhaps, but it's going to formulaically describe that. But even more so, it's based in pointing to things that happened. And the question before us is about things that might have happened, but didn't. So we can't make progress on this question in that way. But fear not, the philosophers have more to say, he says. We can do more with this question still. We just can't know the truth about it. Only facts can be proved with other facts, with things that are possibilities and not facts. Facts have no concern. If we have no other evidence than the evidence of existing facts, the possibility question must remain a mystery, never to be cleared up. And the truth is that facts practically have hardly anything to do with making us either determinists or indeterminists. Okay, he's going to say, like, you don't really care about the facts anyway, and they couldn't have helped you with this question. Sure enough, we make a flourishing of quoting facts this way or that. If we are determinists, we talk about the infallibility with which we can predict one another's conduct. While if we are indeterminists, we lay great stress on the fact that it is just because we cannot foretell one another's conduct, either in war or statecraft or in any other great or small intrigues and business of men, that life is so intensely anxious and hazardous a game. Okay, you're both claiming to have facts, but you can't have facts about things that didn't happen, and that's what the question's all about. Okay, so then after that, which he's quite happy to say, "Hooray, there won't be an argument to prove either one," he then says, "Let's learn about our characters and what kind of world we wanna live in," and you know what? We're not gonna read the rest of it because it's not as relevant. It's super worth reading, and I think we probably did a year 1 video on that very essay when we were talking about the determinism and free will questions, so you might go and find that if you wanna read more about it. What we got to see there, since I couldn't find, feel free to join if you know what I should be looking for here. Um, so what we looked at there was a person who's saying there's room for faith. But there's room for faith because I know for sure that you can't know scientifically what the answer is here. But also, if you hesitate to make so he's going to, we could actually read that part as well. He's going to say, now, wait a minute, why not just be agnostic? Why not just say, well, I don't know? Well, because you have to live. There are certain questions that you actually have to take a position on to move forward, but you can't know. So it requires faith. It requires you to just say, I have faith in science. My mind and my rationality can make sense of the whole causal nexus, which is unbroken and completely umbrellas every phenomena that could ever manifest itself in the universe. And if we just keep doing science, we'll describe and explain everything, and it's all deterministic. Hooray for you. You have faith that it couldn't have been any other way. But you don't have facts that tell you it couldn't have been any other way. You're just inclined to think that way. Congratulations. You have the right to do that. It tells me something about you. That's fine. It doesn't tell me all horrible things about you. It just tells me something about you. Likewise, I don't have facts. Look, I chose to pick this up and therefore it was a choice. And so it wasn't determined. It's just using one word to fill in. It's like I don't have facts about what I could have done otherwise because they're not present to look at. So as a libertarian, I can't tell you, I know for sure, look at this, I've got free will. But I have every right to believe it because I've got to believe one or the other, and neither side has any facts that they can use to tell me which one is right. So we don't have to read the rest of that. You get it from the paraphrase at least. It's at least an example of a philosopher who's saying, if you could just prove everything deterministically, you might be that might not be so desirable. If you can do it, of course, the philosopher isn't saying, well, if you can do it, I'm going to ignore it because I'd rather live in a world where I don't know for sure what the truth is on this question, right? But William James does do that. William James says it's a darn good thing that okay, I shouldn't paraphrase William James without having any textual evidence for it. Um, there certainly are thinkers in philosophy who say it's a darn good thing that you cannot prove that God exists because it's not that type of a question and it would abolish all reason for faith. And there are, of course, religious people who say the same thing. And Aquinas brings that up as something to object to. So I thought we'd look at least some of those thinkers a little bit. We looked at them a little bit. Maybe we don't need to look further since I don't have the best um, book with an excerpt of what I was looking for. I swear I did, but we got a little bit of the idea of how to think like that. Further, the essence is the middle. Okay, that's more Aristotelianism, and we saw a lot of that yesterday in a 4 hour and 45-minute video, which was awesome. So if you want to know more about Aristotle, check out that last video. It's pretty clear that Aquinas is thinking this way, thinking the way Aristotle thought, and he's a good scholastic, which was what we've been saying from the start, but it was quite demonstrated in that last video. All right. Further, if the existence of God were demonstrated, this could only be from his effects, but his effects are not proportionate to him. Okay, so you can't fully know him. All right. And we know what Aquinas' answers to that. I'm not fully knowing God with this proof. I'm just knowing that he exists. That's just one tiny detail. Okay, so let's see if there's anything else. Do we have anything else? We had the metaphysics of Aristotle. I'll close out of that, close out of that. We've read a few bits from the Meno and the Phaedo. We've read a little bit of William James. Okay. So here's the worst one. Here's the heaviest one, and so I saved it for last. Let's go up to the section where the question is, oh no, this is not right. Okay. Yeah, the question on the existence of God, down to the last section. Okay. We're going to read one more piece of philosophy and of literature. This is the heaviest one, so I wanted to not get into too many other heavier things before we did it. But we're going to look at this objection to the existence of God. So now we've left behind arguments about God's existence, and we've entered the section where Aquinas is going to actually try to argue that God exists. And we spent 2 or 3 videos ago, we read this, I think it was 2 videos ago. You can look at the 5 ways that he thinks he can demonstrate God exists. You can look at our last video, very long, where we see all the Aristotelian thoughts that are in there. But there's an objection here. It seems that God does not exist, says the objector, because if one of two contraries be infinite, the other would be altogether destroyed. But the word God means that he is infinite goodness. If therefore God existed, there would be no evil. You couldn't discover it anywhere. But there is evil in the world. Therefore, God does not exist. Very well put argument, very well put objection. In our year 1 material course, we're going to be doing a whole section of lots of excerpts of different philosophers arguing about the problem of evil in the philosophy of religion section. We're not going to do that right now. What we're going to do instead is say that was well put, and it was short, and it was straightforward. It says if God's all good and infinite, there shouldn't be one speck of evil, but we've discovered evil in the world, therefore God does not exist. We have Aquinas's arguments proving that God does exist, and then his answer to this question. His reply to the objection is that since God is the highest good, he would not allow evil to exist in his world unless his omnipotence and goodness were such as to bring good even out of evil. This is part of the infinite goodness of God that he should. Okay, it's a good argument. It's an interesting argument. It's a possible argument. It's a Panglossian argument, right? Intellectually, the argument against God's existence up there was pretty sharp, not a lot of feeling, pretty logical. And the response is a little Panglossian, right? It's a little like, oh, it's the best of all possible worlds. It doesn't matter if it doesn't look that way. I'm not going to quarrel with the logic of either the objector or Aquinas's response to it because he's got lots of other sections to flesh out all of that and to see if that could be the case. All Aquinas has to do in that section is not have a knockdown argument dealing with evil. All he has to do is say the fact that evil exists doesn't disprove that God could exist. And here's 5 reasons why we know God exists. So we'll deal with evil more later. All I have to do is show that there's still room for there to be some evil in the world and yet still be an infinitely good God. That's all he has to do to dismiss that argument for now. However, there's not a lot of feeling in that. No reason why there should be. That wasn't the point of it. But what we're going to do is take a look at a famous excerpt from a literary work. Some of you already know what's coming. It's brought up every time this topic is brought up in religious studies, in philosophical studies of theology. Um, it's probably the best put version of the problem of evil argument in literary form. It's quite gripping. And we're going to read the excerpt from Dostoevsky, where Alyosha's brother is trying to convince him not to be a stupid priest and dedicate his life to religion because of all the evil he's seen in the world. And he starts telling him about how it wouldn't be good for there to be a God who allowed any of that, no matter what the outcome and no matter what the consequences are. And Alyosha has a response, but the argument against believing in God because of the sufferings of little children, 454 in this book, is so strong and so well put that Alyosha himself is weeping when he cries out his answer at the end. Excuse me. So I figured, since what we're doing is, I might have wanted to spend a little more time on Plato, but we got to do a little bit last time. We're just looking at little excerpts of things to just sort of complement what's going on here. What did I have here? What is this? This was supposed to also be talked about? No, we can get rid of that. Okay. So we've done the first treatise, we've done the second treatise. Well, not the second treatise. We've done the first question, which is the first treatise, and the first question of the second treatise. Once we get our nice little debate with Tartaglia going and recorded, we'll then jump into the second question of the second treatise. And as we're reading through all of Aquinas, and as you've seen on the website, we'll just keep adding more and more resources and things to this. The videos are in there. DM me if you want access to this, if you want to be a part of it, if you want to contribute some writings to it. But so far, what we'll do is we'll read what we're about to read. But so far, what we've done is we've done, I think, 7 videos now, reading through the Summa Theologica, the Summa Theologica by Thomas Aquinas. And we've seen some interesting things. We've seen that he's talking to philosophers all across the ages. He's giving them voices. He understands their ideas, even if we imagine they were invented in the 1800s or 1900s. He has those ideas available to him, and he's giving his responses from the pre-Socratics. We've seen from Aristotle, from Plato, we've seen, and even in the objectors, we've seen him say, "Oh, here's a guy who would disagree with me." Well, yeah, but that's coming from Anaximander, or that's coming from Socrates, or that's coming from William James or Kierkegaard. So we just thought we'd take any excuse to bring in some of those things and take a look at them. We didn't do a comprehensive version of that, to be honest. There's some other things that we might have added. Maybe we'll do a third video like this before we move on. But what we've done is we've looked at, I'm trying to, okay, we did the second treatise, The Nature and Extent of Divine Doctrine, and or the treatise on sacred doctrine with one question, this question, and we've dealt with all the 10 questions within it. And then we also did the second treatise, starts with this one question, the existence of God, and we've read through and done videos on all of that. Now we're doing our summation of all of that, and then we're going to start with the simplicity of God argument next, after we do maybe one more video adding a few supplementary things and that debate with Tartaglia. Now that that's all done, to remind you what we've been doing and what we will be doing, we're going to end today with another little piece of philosophy that is relevant to what we've been discussing. Fyodor Dostoevsky's The Sufferings of Little Children. I must make you one confession, Ivan began. I could never understand how one can love one's neighbors. It's just one's neighbors, to my mind, that one can't love, though one might love those at a distance. I once read somewhere of John the Merciful, a saint, that when a hungry, frozen beggar came to him, he took him into his bed, held him in his arms, and began breathing into his mouth, which was putrid and loathsome from some awful disease. I am convinced that he did that from self-laceration, from the self-laceration of falsity, for the sake of the charity imposed by duty, as a penance laid on him. For anyone to love a man, he must be hidden, for as soon as he shows his face, love is gone. Father Zosima, so Alyosha responds, Father Zosima has talked of that more than once, observed Alyosha. He too said that the face of a man often hinders many people not practiced in love from loving him. But yet there's a great deal of love in mankind and almost Christ-like love. I know that myself, Ivan. Well, I know nothing of it so far and can't understand it. And the innumerable mass of mankind are, with me, there. The question is whether that's due to men's bad qualities or whether it's inherent in their nature. To my thinking, Christ-like love for men is a miracle, impossible on earth. He was God, but we are not gods. Suppose I, for instance, suffer intensely. Another can never know how much I suffer because he's another and not I. And what's more, a man is rarely ready to admit another's suffering, as though it were a distinction. Why won't he admit it, do you think? Because I smell unpleasant? Because I have a stupid face? Because I once trod on his foot? Besides, there is suffering and suffering, degrading, humiliating suffering such as humbles me. Hunger, for instance. My benefactor will perhaps allow me, but when you come to higher suffering, for an idea, for instance, he will very rarely admit that. Perhaps because my face strikes him as not at all what he fancies a man should have who suffers for an idea. And so he deprives me instantly of his favor, and not at all from badness of heart. Beggars, especially genteel beggars, ought never to show themselves, but to ask for charity through the newspapers. One can love one's neighbors in the abstract or even at a distance, but at close quarters, it's almost impossible. If it were as on the stage in the ballet, where if beggars come in, they wear silken rags and tattered lace and beg for alms, dancing gracefully, then one might like looking at them. But even then, we should not love them. But enough of that. I simply wanted to show you my point of view. I meant the compulsion. I meant to speak this is so profound. I meant to speak of the suffering of mankind generally, but we had better confine ourselves to the sufferings of the children. That reduces the scope of my argument to a tenth of what it might be. Still, we'd better keep to the children, though it does weaken my case. But in the first place, children can be loved even at close quarters, even when they are dirty, even when they are ugly. I fancy, though, children never are ugly. The second reason why I won't speak of grown up people is that besides being disgusting and unworthy of love, they have a compensation. They've eaten the apple and know good and evil, and they have become like God. They go on eating it still, but the children haven't eaten anything and are so far innocent. Are you fond of children, Alyosha? I know you are, and you will understand why I prefer to speak of them. If they too suffer horribly on earth, they must suffer for their father's sins. They must be punished for their fathers who have eaten the apple. But that reasoning is for the other world and is incomprehensible for the heart of man here on earth. The innocent must not suffer for another's sins, and especially such innocence. You may be surprised at me, Alyosha, but I am awfully fond of children too, and observe cruel people. The violent, the rapacious, the Karamazovs are sometimes very fond of children. Children, while they are quite little, up to 7, for instance, are so remote from grown up people. They're different creatures, as it were, of a different species. I knew a criminal in prison who had, in the course of his career as a burglar, murdered whole families, including several children. But when he was in prison, he had a strange affection for them. He spent all his time at his window watching the children playing in the prison yard. He trained one little boy to come up to his window and made great friends with him. You don't know why I'm telling you all this, Alyosha. My head aches and I am sad. You speak with a strange air, observed Alyosha uneasily. as though you were not quite yourself. By the way, a Bulgarian I met lately in Moscow, Ivan went on, seeming not to hear his brother's words, told me about the crimes committed by Turks and Circassians in all parts of Bulgaria through fear of a general rising of the Slavs. They burnt villages, murder, outrage women and children. They nail their prisoners by the ears to the fences, leave them so till morning, and in the morning they hang them. All sorts of things you can't imagine. People talk sometimes of bestial cruelty, but that is a great insult and injustice to the beasts. A beast can never be so cruel as a man, so artistically cruel. The tiger only tears and gnaws. That's all he can do. He would never think of nailing people by the ears, even if he were able to do it. These Turks took a pleasure in torturing children too, cutting the unborn child from the mother's womb and tossing babies up in the air and catching them on the points of their bayonets right before their mother's eyes. Doing it before the mother's eyes was what gave zest to the amusement. Here is another scene that I thought very interesting. Imagine a trembling mother with her baby in her arms, a circle of invading Turks around her. They've planned a diversion. They pet the baby, laugh to make it laugh. They succeed. The baby laughs. At that moment, a Turk points a pistol 4 inches from the baby's face. The baby laughs with glee, holds out its little hand to the pistol, and he pulls the trigger in the baby's face and blows out its brains. Artistic, wasn't it? By the way, Turks are particularly fond of sweet things, they say. Brother, what are you driving at? Asked Alyosha. I think if the devil doesn't exist, but man has created him, he has created him in his own image and likeness, just as he did God then, observed Alyosha. It's wonderful how you can turn words, as Polonius says in Hamlet, laughed Ivan. You can turn my words against me. Well, I'm glad. Yours must be a fine God if man created him in his image and likeness. You asked just now what I was driving at. You see, I am fond of collecting certain facts, and would you believe I even copy anecdotes of a certain sort from newspapers and books? I've already got a fine collection. The Turks, of course, have gone into it, but they are foreigners. I have specimens from home that are even better than the Turks. You know, we prefer beating, rods and scourges. That's our national institution. Nailing ears is unthinkable for us, for we are, after all, Europeans. But the rod and the scourge, we have always with us, and they cannot be taken from us. Abroad now, they scarcely do any beating. Manners are more humane, or laws have been passed so that they don't dare to flog men now. But they make up for it in another way, just as national as ours, and so national that it would be practically impossible among us, though I believe we are being inoculated with it, since the religious movement began in our aristocracy. I have a charming pamphlet translated from the French describing how, quite recently, 5 years ago, a murderer, Richard, was executed, a young man, I believe of 23, who repented and was converted to the Christian faith at the very scaffold. This Richard was an illegitimate child who was given as a child of 6 by his parents to some shepherds on the Swiss mountains. They brought him up to work for them. He grew up like a little wild beast among them. The shepherds taught him nothing and scarcely fed or clothed him, but sent him out at 7 to herd the flock in cold and wet. And no one hesitated or scrupled to treat him so. Quite the contrary, they thought they had every right, for Richard had been given to them as a chattel, and they did not even see the necessity of feeding him. Richard himself describes how, in those years, like the prodigal son in the gospel, he longed to eat of the mash given to the pigs, which were fattened for sale. But they wouldn't even give him that, and beat him when he stole from the pigs. And that was how he spent all his childhood and his youth, till he grew up and was strong enough to go away and be a thief. The savage began to earn his living as a day laborer in Geneva. He drank what he earned. He lived like a brute and finished by killing and robbing an old man. He was caught, tried, and condemned to death. They are not sentimentalists there. And in prison, he was immediately surrounded by pastors, members of Christian brotherhoods, philanthropic ladies, and the like. They taught him to read and write in prison and expounded the gospel to him. They exhorted him, working upon him, drummed at him incessantly, till at last he solemnly confessed his crime. He was converted. He wrote to the court himself that he was a monster, but that in the end, God had vouchsafed him light and shown grace. All Geneva was in excitement about him. You are our brother. You have found grace. And Richard does nothing but weep with emotion. Yes, I've found grace. All my youth and childhood I was glad of pig's food, but now even I have found grace. I am dying in the Lord. Yes, Richard, die in the Lord. You have shed blood and must die, though it's not your fault that you knew not the Lord when you coveted the pig's food and were beaten for stealing it, which was very wrong of you, for stealing is forbidden. But you've shed blood and you must die. And on the last day, Richard, perfectly limp, did nothing but cry and repeat every minute, "This is my happiest day. I am going to the Lord." "Yes," cry the pastors and the judges and the philanthropic ladies. "This is the happiest day of your life, for you are going to the Lord." They all walk or drive to the scaffold in procession behind the prison van. All the scaffold, at the scaffold, they call to Richard, "Die, brother, die in the Lord, for even thou hast found grace." And so, covered with his brother's kisses, Richard is dragged onto the scaffold and led to the guillotine, and they chopped off his head in brotherly fashion because he had found grace. Yes, that's characteristic. That pamphlet is translated into Russian by some Russian philanthropists of our of aristocratic rank and evangelical aspirations, and has been distributed gratis for the enlightenment of the people. The case of Richard is interesting because it's national. Though to us, it's absurd to cut off a man's head because he has become our brother and has found grace. Yet we have our own speciality, which is all but worse. Our historical pastime is the direct satisfaction of inflicting pain. There are lines in Nekrasov describing pleasant how a peasant lashes a horse on the eyes, on its meek eyes, quote. Everyone must have seen it. It's particularly Russian. He describes how a feeble little nag had foundered under too heavy a load and cannot move. The peasant beats it savagely, beats it at last, not knowing what he is doing in the intoxication of cruelty, thrashes it mercilessly over and over again. However weak you are, you must pull. If you die for it, the nag strains. And then he begins lashing the poor defenseless creature on its weeping, on its meek eyes, quote unquote. The frantic beast tugs and draws the load, tumbling all over, gasping for breath, moving sideways with a sort of unnatural spasmodic action. It's awful in Nekrasov. But that's only a horse, and God has given horses to be beaten. So the Tatars have taught us, and they left us the knout as a remembrance of it. But men, too, can be beaten. A well-educated, cultured gentleman and his wife beat their own child with a birch rod, a girl of 7. I have an exact account of it. The papa was glad that the birch was covered with twigs. "It stings more," said he, and so he began stinging his daughter. I know for a fact there are people who at every blow are worked up to sensuality, to literal sensuality, which increases progressively at every blow they inflict. They beat for a minute, for 5 minutes, for 10 minutes, more often and more savagely. The child screams. At last, the child cannot scream. It gasps, "Daddy, Daddy." By some diabolical, unseemly chance, the case was brought into court. A counsel is engaged. The Russian people have long called a barrister a conscience for hire. The counsel protests in his client's defense. It's such a simple thing, he says. An everyday domestic event. A father corrects his child. To our shame be it said, it is brought into court. The jury, convinced by him, gives a favorable verdict. The public roars with delight that the torturer is acquitted. Ah, pity I wasn't there. I would have proposed to raise a subscription in his honor. Charming pictures. But I've still better things about children. I've collected a great, great deal about Russian children, Alyosha. There was a little girl of 5 who was hated by her father and mother. Most worthy and respectable people of good education and breeding, unquote. You see, I must repeat again, it is a peculiar characteristic of many people, this love of torturing children and children only. To all other types of humanity, these torturers behave mildly and benevolently, like cultivated and humane Europeans, but they are very fond of tormenting children, even fond of children themselves in that sense. It's just their defenselessness that tempts the tormentor, just the angelic confidence of the child who has no refuge and no appeal that sets his vile blood on fire. In every man, of course, a demon lies hidden, the demon of rage, the demon of lustful heat at the screams of the tortured victim, the demon of lawlessness let off the chain, the demon of diseases that follow on vice, gout, kidney disease, and so on. This poor child of 5 was subjected to every possible torture by these cultivated parents. They beat her, thrashed her, kicked her for no reason, till her body was one bruise. Then they went to greater refinements of cruelty, shut her up all night in a cold and frost in the cold and frost of a privy. And because she didn't ask to be taken up at night, as though a child of 5 sleeping its angelic sound sleep could be trained to wake and ask, they smeared her face and filled her mouth with excrement. And it was her mother who did this. Her mother did this. And that mother could sleep, hearing the poor child's groans. Can you understand why a little creature who can't even understand what's done to her should beat her little aching heart with her tiny fist in the dark on the cold and weep her meek, resentful tears to dear, kind God to protect her? Do you understand that, friend and brother, you pious and humble novice? Do you understand why this infamy must be and is permitted? Without it, I am told, man could not have existed on earth, for he could not have known good and evil. Why should he know that diabolical good and evil when it costs so much? Why the whole world of knowledge is not worth that child's prayer to dear kind God. I say nothing of the sufferings of grown up people. They have eaten the apple, damn them, and the devil take them all. But these little ones, I'm making you suffer, Alyosha. You are not yourself. I'll leave you if you like. Never mind, says Alyosha. I want to suffer too. One picture, one more, only one more, because it's so curious, so characteristic. And I've only just read it in some collection of Russian antiques. I've forgotten the name. I must look it up. It was in the darkest days of serfdom at the beginning of the century, and long live the liberator of the people. There was in those days a general of aristocratic connections, the owner of great estates, one of those men somewhat exceptional, I believe, even then, who, retiring from the service into a life of leisure, are convinced that they have earned absolute power over the lives of their subjects. There were such men then. So our general settled on his property of 2,000 souls, lives in pomp, and domineers over his poor neighbors as though they were dependents and buffoons. He has kennels of hundreds of hounds and nearly 100 dog boys, all mounted and in uniform. One day, a serf boy, a little child of 8, threw a stone in play and hurt the paw of the general's favorite hound. Why is my favorite hound lame? He is told that the boy threw a stone that hurt the dog's paw. So you did it. The general looked the child up and down. Take him. He was taken from his mother and kept shut up all night. Early that morning, the general comes out on horseback with the hounds, his dependents, dog boys, and huntsmen, all mounted round him in full hunting parade. The servants are summoned for their edification, and in front of them all stands the mother of the child. The child is brought from the lockup. It's a gloomy, cold, foggy autumn day, a capital day for hunting. The general orders the child to be undressed. The child is stripped naked. He shivers, numb with terror, not daring to cry. Make him run, commands the general. Run, run, shout the dog boys. The boy runs. At him, yells the general, and he sets the whole pack of hounds on the child. The hounds catch him and tear him to pieces before his mother's eyes. I believe the general was afterwards declared incapable of administering his estates. Well, what did he deserve? To be shot? To be shot for the satisfaction of our moral feelings? Speak, Alyosha. To be shot, murmured Alyosha, lifting his eyes to Ivan with a pale, twisted smile. Bravo, cried Ivan, delighted. If even you say so, you're a pretty monk. So there is a little devil sitting in your heart, Alyosha Karamazov. What I said was absurd, but that's just the point. That but, cried Ivan. Let me tell you, novice, that the absurd is only too necessary on earth. The world stands on absurdities, and perhaps nothing would have come to pass in it without them. We know what we know. What do we know? I understand nothing, Ivan went on, as though in delirium. I don't want to understand anything now. I want to stick to the fact. I made up my mind long ago not to understand. If I try to understand anything, I shall be false to the fact, and I have determined to stick to the fact. Why are you trying me? Alyosha cried with sudden distress. Will you say what you mean at last? Of course I will. That's what I've been leading up to. You are dear to me. I don't want to let you go. And I won't give you up to your Zosima. Ivan for a minute was silent. His face became all at once very sad. Listen, I took the case of children only to make my case clearer. Of the other tears of humanity, with which the earth is soaked from its crust to its center, I will say nothing. I have narrowed my subject on purpose. I am a bug, and I recognize in all humility that I cannot understand why the world is arranged as it is. Men are themselves to blame, I suppose. They are given paradise, they wanted freedom and stole fire from heaven, though they knew they would become unhappy. So there's no need to pity them. With my pitiful, earthly, Euclidean understanding, all I know is that there is suffering and that there are none guilty, that cause follows effect, simply and directly, that everything flows and finds its level. But that's only Euclidean nonsense. I know that, and I can't consent to live by it. All things work out. I can't consent to live by that. What comfort is it to me that there are none guilty and that cause follows effect simply and directly, and that I know it? I must have justice or I will destroy myself. And not justice in some remote infinite time and space, but here on earth, and that I could see myself. I've believed in it. I want to see it. And if I am dead by then, let me rise again. For if It all happens without me. It will be too unfair. Surely I haven't suffered. Simply that I, my crimes and my sufferings, may manure the soil of the future harmony for somebody else. I want to see it with my own eyes. To the hind lie down with the lion and the victim rise up and embrace his murderer. I want to be there when everyone suddenly understands what it's all been for. All the religions of the world are built on this longing, and I am a believer. But then there are the children. And what am I to do about them? That's a question I can't answer. For the 100th time, I repeat, there are numbers of questions, but I've only taken the children because in their case, what I mean is so unanswerably clear. Listen, if all must suffer to pay for the eternal harmony, what have children to do with it? Tell me, please. It's beyond all comprehension why they should suffer and why they should pay for the harmony. Why should they too furnish material to enrich the soil for the harmony of the future? I understand solidarity in sin amongst men. I understand solidarity in retribution too, but there can be no such solidarity with children. And if it is really true that they must share responsibility for all their father's crimes, such a truth is not of this world and is beyond my comprehension. Some jester will say, perhaps, that the child would have grown up and have sinned. But you see, he didn't grow up. He was torn to pieces by the dogs at 8 years old. Oh, Alyosha, I am not blaspheming. I understand, of course, what an upheaval of the universe it will be when everything in heaven and earth blends in one hymn of praise, and everything that lives and has lived cries aloud, Thou art just, O Lord, for thy ways are revealed. When the mother embraces the fiend who threw her child to the dogs, and all three cry aloud with tears, Thou art just, O Lord. Then, of course, the crown of knowledge will be reached and all will be made clear. But what pulls me up here is that I can't accept that harmony. And while I am on earth, I make haste to take my own measures. You see, Alyosha, perhaps it really may happen that if I live to that moment or rise again to see it, I too, perhaps, may cry aloud with the rest, looking at the mother, embracing the child's torturer, Thou art just, O Lord. But I don't want to cry aloud then. While there is still time, I hasten to protect myself. And so I renounce the higher harmony altogether. It's not worth the tears of that one tortured child who beat itself on the breast with its little fist and prayed in its stinking outhouse with its unexpiated tears to dear kind God. It's not worth it because those tears are unatoned for. They must be atoned for, or there can be no harmony. But how? How are you going to atone for them? Is it possible? By their being avenged. But what do I care for avenging them? What do I care for a hell for oppressors? What good can hell do since those children have already been tortured? And what becomes of harmony if there is a hell? I want to forgive. I want to embrace. I don't want more suffering. And if the sufferings of children go to swell the sum of sufferings which was necessary to pay for truth, then I protest that the truth is not worth such a price. I don't want the mother to embrace the oppressor who threw her son to the dogs. She dare not forgive him. Let her forgive him for herself, if she will. Let her forgive the torturer for the immeasurable suffering of her mother's heart. But the sufferings of her tortured child, she has no right to forgive. She dare not forgive the torturer, even if the child were to forgive him. And if that is so, if they dare not forgive, what becomes of harmony? Is there in the whole world a being who would have the right to forgive and could forgive? I'm going to read that question again. Is there in the whole world a being who would have the right to forgive and could forgive? I don't want harmony. From love for humanity, I don't want it. I would rather be left with the unavenged suffering. I would rather remain with my unavenged suffering and unsatisfied indignation, even if I were wrong. Besides, too high a price is asked for harmony. It's beyond our means to pay so much to enter on it. So I hasten to give back my entrance ticket. And if I am an honest man, I am bound to give it back as soon as possible. And that I am doing. It's not God that I don't accept, Alyosha. Only I most respectfully return him the ticket. It's rebellion, murmured Alyosha, looking down. Rebellion? I'm sorry you call it that, said Ivan earnestly. One can hardly live in rebellion, and I want to live. Now tell me yourself. I challenge you. Answer. Imagine that you are creating a fabric of human destiny with the object of making men happy in the end, giving them peace and rest at last, but that it was essential and inevitable to torture to death only one tiny creature, that baby beating its breast with its fist, for instance, and to found an edifice on its unavenged tears. Would you consent to be the architect in those under those conditions? Tell me. Tell me the truth. No, I wouldn't consent, said Alyosha softly. You can admit the idea that men for whom you are building it would agree to accept their happiness on the foundation of the unexpiated blood of a little victim, and accepting it would remain happy forever? No, I can't admit it, brother, said Alyosha suddenly with flashing eyes. You said just now, is there a being in the whole world who would have the right to forgive and could forgive? But there is a being, and he can forgive everything, all and for all, because he gave his innocent blood for all and everything. You've forgotten him, and on him is built the edifice. And it is to him they cry aloud, Thou art just, O Lord, for thy ways are revealed. It is not possible to get through that. Mm. It is not possible to read through that. I'm sorry. I apologize. Okay. We'll call it quits there probably. More stuff to come. We'll continue reading all that stuff you already know. All right. Bye.